In 1986, Vietnam's economy was in ruins. Inflation hit 774%. Farmers were starving. The country was isolated by international sanctions. Fast forward to today, Vietnam's GDP has grown 20-fold. It's become the world's second-largest rice exporter, a global manufacturing powerhouse, and home to Samsung's biggest smartphone factories outside of South Korea. This isn't just another economic success story. This is about how a nation rewrote its destiny in a single generation, using strategies so bold that even economists didn't see it coming. What hidden forces transformed Vietnam from a war-torn wasteland into one of Asia's fastest-growing economies? The answer lies in secrets most people have never heard about. December 1986. Vietnam's Communist Party made a decision that would shock the world. They called it Moy Renovation. But this wasn't just reform. This was economic revolution. Imagine a country where farmers couldn't own land, where private businesses were illegal, where the state controlled everything. Then, overnight, land was given to individual families. Private enterprises became legal. Foreign investment was welcomed. The results were immediate and dramatic. Rice production jumped 2.8 times within a decade. Vietnam went from importing rice to feed its people to becoming the world's second-largest rice exporter by the 2000s. That's like going from bankruptcy to millionaire status, but for an entire nation. But here's the first untold secret. This wasn't just about freeing markets. Vietnam's leaders did something most countries never attempt. They paired economic liberation with massive investments in human capital. While other developing nations focused purely on attracting cheap manufacturing, Vietnam played a different game. They invested heavily in education from day one. The numbers tell an incredible story. Primary school enrollment hit 98%. Literacy rates soared to 95%. Vietnamese students now score on par with OECD countries in international tests. This created something rare: a young, educated, and trainable workforce. But here's what makes it even more remarkable. Vietnam has one of the youngest populations in the world. Half the population is under 35. That's 50 million young, skilled workers entering the job market just as global companies were looking for alternatives to China. When Samsung was choosing where to build its next mega factory, they didn't just see cheap labor in Vietnam. They saw engineers who could innovate. Today, Samsung employs tens of thousands of Vietnamese workers and exports over $650 billion worth of products from Vietnam annually. Most countries sign a few trade deals and call it a day. Vietnam? They turned trade agreements into an art form. Here's the strategy most people miss. Vietnam didn't just join trade blocs, they strategically positioned themselves at the center of global supply chains. First, they joined ASEAN in 1995. Then came the game changer, a bilateral trade agreement with the United States in 2000, ending decades of economic isolation. But the real masterstroke was joining the World Trade Organization in 2007. Each agreement opened new markets, but more importantly, each one forced Vietnam to upgrade its standards, improve its institutions, and become more competitive. The recent deals are even more impressive. The EU-Vietnam Free Trade Agreement eliminated 99% of tariffs, giving Vietnam unprecedented access to the world's richest market. The result? Vietnam's exports to Europe jumped from $35 billion to over $48 billion in just 4 years. But here's the secret sauce. While other countries saw trade deals as endpoints, Vietnam saw them as stepping stones to something bigger. Vietnam didn't just attract foreign investment, they engineered it. By 2025, Vietnam attracted over $24 billion in foreign direct investment in just 7 months. But here's what's brilliant about their approach. They didn't compete on cheap labor alone. They competed on strategic positioning. When the US-China trade war erupted, global companies needed a China plus one strategy. Vietnam was perfectly positioned, close enough to China for supply chain efficiency, but politically neutral enough to avoid tariffs. The numbers are staggering. 70% of Vietnam's exports now come from foreign-invested companies. Apple manufactures 20% of its iPads and Apple Watches in Vietnam. Intel, Canon, LG, they've all built massive operations here. But Vietnam's real genius was in the details. They didn't just offer tax breaks. They built 343 industrial zones with world-class infrastructure. They streamlined customs procedures. They trained workers to international standards. The result? Vietnam became the second-largest electronics exporter in Southeast Asia, manufacturing everything from smartphones to semiconductors. While other countries talked about infrastructure, Vietnam built it, aggressively. They spent over 10% of GDP annually on infrastructure for the past decade, among the highest investment rates in the world. The results are visible everywhere. 99% of households now have electricity, up from less than 50% in 1990. But here's the strategic brilliance. Vietnam didn't just build roads and ports. They built economic ecosystems. Take the North-South High-Speed Railway project, a $67 billion investment that will connect the entire country. Or the new deep water ports that can handle the world's largest container ships. Every project was designed not just for today's needs, but for tomorrow's opportunities. The $2 billion 25 infrastructure budget alone is $36 billion, a 40% increase from previous plans. This isn't just spending, it's strategic positioning for the next phase of growth. But here's where Vietnam's story gets really interesting. They're facing challenges that could either derail their progress or propel them to the next level. Climate change hits Vietnam harder than almost any other country. Sea level rise threatens the Mekong Delta, the rice bowl that feeds much of Asia. Typhoons are getting stronger. Flooding is getting worse. Most countries would see this as a roadblock. Vietnam sees it as an opportunity to lead the green transition. They've committed to net zero carbon emissions by 2050, an incredibly ambitious target for a developing economy. They're becoming a manufacturing hub for solar panels and wind turbines. The digital economy now contributes over 18% of GDP, growing at 20% annually. Here's the untold secret. Vietnam is betting that the next phase of global growth will be green and digital. They're positioning themselves not just as the factory of Asia, but as the green factory of Asia. Vietnam has set an audacious goal: become a high-income country by 2045. That requires GDP growth of at least 6% annually for the next 2 decades, a pace that would make most economists nervous. But here's why they might pull it off. Vietnam has consistently defied expectations. When experts predicted they'd hit a middle-income trap, they pivoted to high-tech manufacturing. When trade wars threatened their exports, they became more competitive, not less. The challenges are real: political transitions, environmental pressures, and the need to move up the value chain from assembly to innovation. But Vietnam has shown something remarkable: the ability to turn challenges into advantages. Their secret weapon isn't just policy, it's adaptability. It's the willingness to reinvent themselves not once, but continuously. So what's the real secret behind Vietnam's economic rise? It's not any single policy or reform. It's something deeper. Vietnam succeeded because they understood that in a rapidly changing world, the biggest risk isn't making mistakes, it's standing still. They embraced change when change was hard. They invested in the future when the present was uncertain. They remained humble enough to learn, bold enough to adapt, and patient enough to build for the long term. The question isn't whether Vietnam will continue rising. It's whether other nations can learn from their example. In an era of economic uncertainty, Vietnam proves that with the right strategy, any country can rewrite its destiny. Vietnam defied the odds once. The next chapter will determine if they can do it again, this time while leading the world toward a more sustainable future. What do you think? Can Vietnam make the leap from middle income to high income while staying resilient in an unpredictable world? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching. If you found this video useful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the Capital Compass so you won't miss any future deep dives into the forces shaping our world. See you in the next video.